Me Guyana, land of many waters with 6 races living together.
GlobeSpan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion, with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. GlobeSpan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building. GlobeSpan believes that every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diasporas and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana.
Coffee and Dr. Jagan, Bobby, she gave us our great sons. Rohan Kanhai, Coffee and Dr. Jagan.
As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adopt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. GlobeSpan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
Me Guyana, land of many waters with 6 races living together.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of GlobeSpan. My name is Rusat Ramgopal and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I'm filling in for Dr. Vishnu Bisram. Our topic tonight will be the UN Human Rights Committee's recent report into Guyana. The UN Human Rights Committee periodically reviews human rights situations in certain countries and whether they are living up to the values of the Human Rights Covenant or not. And recently, at the end of March, they published the report into Guyana. We are joined tonight in this discussion by Mr. Ravi Dev, the former leader of ROAR, Mr. Timothy Jonas, Senior Counsel, and Dr. David Hines, as well as Dr. Betaram Ramharak. We are pleased to be joined by these esteemed panelists this evening, and I will give them each a chance to deliver their opening remarks. I'll begin first with Mr. Ravi Dev.
Okay, we're talking about the UN Human Rights Committee report. They took statements from IPADG from Guyana. I think it's important for us to understand that they are going by reports that were submitted to them. IPADG itself referred to some other reports. So that gives a particular perspective to
Mr. Dev, I don't want to interrupt you, but would you mind explaining IPADG and what the acronym stands for those who may not be aware?
Well, it's the International Decade of People of Indian Origin, Guyana. The UN launched this International Decade of People of Indian Origin. It tells you where I'm coming from of
African origin.
In 2013, to which Guyana signed on. There was a very useful summary of how it all came about from Dr. Bertie Ramcharan, who happens to be from my part of the country, West Coast. He's in this week's Stabrook News. And he summarized that basically it came out of the preparation for the 2001 International Conference in South Africa on racism and xenophobia. And Jamaican delegates had made some recommendations about looking at the problems of our people of African descent in particular. And from there, matters grew from 2001. And like I said, eventually the UN itself adopted this decade for countries to help rectify problems that were identified in the people of African descent communities across the world. And I'd like to quote Dr. Ramcharan on this. He's a very high official from the UN Human Rights Department for decades and has served in so many other areas. And he said this after outlining how the decade of people of African descent came about. He said, and I'll quote him, "As a matter of public policy, it needs to be recognized also that there are at least 4 population groups in Guyana in respect to whom parallel reports should be compiled. They are persons of indigenous ancestry as the founding nation, persons of Indian ancestry, and persons of mixed ethnicity. When the international policies described above were developed, they could not, in the circumstances of an international conference, have in view a country with the complex history of Guyana, with the coexistence of 4 major groups of the population. National policies," Dr. Ramcharan is advising, "must be faithful to the international recommendations." But he cautions they must be mindful of the specificities of the Guyanese situation. And while carving out policies and strategies so that the 4 main groups of the population can travel together while developing closer bonds along the journey. Nation building, he concludes, has to be cultivated bearing in mind the specificities of the 4 groups and doing justice to all. I would like to, again, as you asked me, to put that forward as my perspective on what I hope tonight's discussion will be. To summarize that in 2 sentences, to take into consideration the fact that the Human Rights Committee report that was issued was based on submissions made by groups of people of African descent, in specific Itbadaji from Guyana, led by our own Vincent Alexander, with whom we have spent so many evenings on this same platform. And therefore, it cautioned, Dr. Ramcharan cautions that we must also take into consideration the perspectives of other groups in our Guyanese society. And I will hope that tonight we can do that.
Rusat, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Thank you, Mr. Dev. Mr. Jonas, your opening remarks.
This is a dangerous subject, and it's a subject that we need to discuss. I listened to Ravi's opening remarks, and his language was very careful, very cautious. But the gist of what I understood is that we have a report made to the UN body by an organization which comprises essentially Afro-Guyanese. And the report by this organization comprising essentially Afro-Guyanese is that there has been marginalization and victimization of Afro-Guyanese by the current administration. That's what it is. Now, as we get into this discussion, what I am certain will evolve and be exposed And what I found specifically ironic in the response by the government to the United Nations is their clear assertion, and this is the assertion by the PPP government, which I think we can fairly call an organization essentially of Indo-Guyanese, that says the Indo-Guyanese population has historically in Guyana been marginalized and ostracized and victimized and excluded by the rest. So we have a claim by a group that is essentially Afro-Guyanese saying, you're all mistreating us. And then we have a response by a group that is essentially Indo-Guyanese saying, you're all mistreating us. And I'm wondering when we will finally realize that these two groups are looking in a mirror and a pot is looking at a kettle. And there's no difference between the two, except for the convenient red herring that is thrown in, that these colonialists treated us bad 100 years ago. But it's a dangerous topic, but an important one. So let's jump in, shall we?
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. Before we end up having a comment section, which I'm not reading right now, but I'm sure they would. I think it's, PP obviously, I think it's fair to say the majority of the politicians are Indo-Guyanese, but I mean, I think it's probably more accurate to say that it's an Indo-Guyanese support base, but I think that the party does at the, representative levels attempt to have, a more diverse, set of officials in cabinet and ministerial positions, etc. But I'll move on to Dr. David Hines for his opening remarks.
Since you're going to say that as the moderator, I will invite you to say that the same is also true for APNU.
Yes, it's true for
representing the other side. We have pots and kettles.
Yeah, no, exactly. As you said, pots and kettles. It's true for both sides that when they do get in government, they try to have, at least some attempt at diversity and representation. It's Dr. Hines. Dr. Hines, I think you're on mute.
Thanks. Are you hearing me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, thanks. It's a dangerous topic, as Mr. Jonas said, and but it's a topic that is central to our country, and however much we try to avoid it, it's not going to go away. I think Ravi is conflating two things. There is the United Nations Human Rights Committee that did their hearings a few weeks ago, and the government responded in the person of Mr. Shearer. And then there is the Special Committee for the Decade of African People, which is what I assume we are dealing with tonight. So the recent forum in Geneva was a special forum on African people, people of African descent. So we just don't want to confuse the two. The Human Rights Committee story was a few weeks ago, and I suppose what we're dealing with tonight is the special forum on the people of African descent. And I just want to say that the United Nations declared a decade. It declared a year, and then it declared a decade for the people of African descent. And the objective of the decade was to draw attention, and this is the United Nations, it's not David Hines, draw attention to the fact that given the experience of enslavement of African people, that there are consequences of that experience that are still present in countries today. And the United Nations said that most countries have made great strides at the level of the law and the level of the constitution in dealing with the institutional racism that African people have faced since slavery ended. But that was not enough, that countries needed to go further in dealing with the systemic and institutional racism, hence the decade. And IPADG's report is that the government signed on to that, which meant that the government signed on to an undertaking that it would move beyond where it was 10 years ago, beyond the laws and so on, and to deal with the actual experiences of African people. And that IPADG is saying that the decade is almost over and that the government has not moved in that direction. It's not moved further than it did 10 years ago. The government responded by saying there is nothing to do, that our laws are not discriminatory, that African people are not discriminated by law, and that if African people find themselves at a disadvantage economically, it's not the government's fault. It is because they made some bad business choices after emancipation in 1838. And so therefore, it's their fault. It's not the government's fault, and the government has nothing to do. That, in essence, is the exchange between the two. My brother Jonas said that the exchange is that one is saying it's marginalized and the other one is saying we too are marginalized. But it's more than that. It's that one is agreeing with the United Nations that marginalization of Africans because of slavery is institutionalized in Guyana and other countries where Africans find themselves, and that the laws have not gone far enough to deal with that discrimination and marginalizations, and that governments committed themselves in the decade to move further than the status quo. And that the charge by IPADG is that the government of Guyana has not moved further. And the government of Guyana responded and said, yes, we have not moved further because there's nothing else that we can do. The laws are clear, they're not discriminatory. And yes, African people find themselves at a disadvantage economically, but it's their fault because of business choices they made in 1838. That is, in essence, is the exchange between the two. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hines. And before we move on, before there's any further confusion, when I was asked to host the program, the information I was given is that the focus would be on the UN Human Rights Committee report. But obviously, I know that there is people who want to talk about the recent UN forum with representatives of IPADG presented information too. So we're going to all incorporate both as best as possible in tonight's discussion. All right. So Dr. Hines, I just want to address that. Now, Dr. Ramarak, your opening remarks.
Well, I take the point that David said, which is we're looking at two different things here, right? The IPADG report. Obviously, this was a report that was done some time back. I had seen the original report, and then the other one, which we have recently, was the human rights examination of human rights affairs in Guyana by this UN committee. So let me just say a few things. Obviously, I don't know if it's about looking at something that's dangerous. I think more so it's about looking at something that's realistic about us in Guyana, which is that it has to do with relationships and how the two major ethnic groups relate to each other, and how we can kind of work to create a path forward so we can kind of coexist without revisiting or reinventing or recreating some of the tragedies we've seen in the 60s. I spent the last 2 weeks in the London archives looking at newspapers from the 1960s, and I can tell you it was such a traumatic experience just looking at the headlines day by day from the 1960s, 61, 62, 64, and so on. So we certainly don't want to go back to that. So what I'm seeing is a couple of things there. One is I don't think anybody have a problem with an organization. And by the way, IPADG is sort of a combination of many different organizations, I believe, and maybe David can correct me or one of you folks here. I think there's about 78 organizations that are part of Epadaji. And my point is, nobody has a problem with what Epadaji is doing in terms of uplifting, the African Guyanese. But to be more specific to the report that we have seen that Epadaji has compiled, which also was submitted to the UN. The language, obviously, we are familiar with that language because we've had discussions with Vincent Alexander, I think Eric Phillips, and some of the quotations and the language also reflects his thinking. We don't have a problem with that. But my problem with looking at that report is that it is, in a sense, it does not take into consideration, the fact that we are a multiracial society. And the focus, obviously, is on Africans, which is fair enough. But that whole notion of existing in a society where other ethnic communities should be able to coexist, that point seems to somehow disappear from that Epadaji report. I'll give an example of something that is also which I think inflammatory. And by the way, I think the report that we saw from the government, which they submitted to the UN, I thought that was fair in the sense that, at least in the opening pages, it did address the Indian concern, right? I don't know who was who were the authors who were involved in that, but this to me is something very unique where you're seeing the Indian voice giving a play, and whoever did that, I have to give credit to that. But to come back to the Epadaji report, what I'm saying here is that here's an example of something, which can be very inflammatory, right? And I'll cite a couple of words from that report, and this is verbatim. According to the report, two forces shape race relations in Guyana today and negatively impact the human rights of African Guyanese. And the report now focuses on two things, which is very alarming to me, at least the first one, which is that it says one of those forces has to do with Hindu nationalism and its philosophical caste underpinnings. And then the report continues, in a sense, to explain that whatever is happening in Guyana, whether it's discrimination or infringement upon the rights of African Guyanese, is as a result of this sort of a caste conception. But I don't know how you could make that assessment. I mean, it's a more complex situation than this. Every society have issues where people have to relate with other people in their community, whether it's light skin, dark skin, or whatever. That's a historical phenomenon. It exists in every society. So to kind of pin all of this entire, perception about Africans on the Indian caste system, I think is really dishonest. And then the report also, which is something, that comes up very often in Guyanese society, is that it traces this conception back to something called the colonization scheme, right? Which is really known as the Lacoon-Noonan scheme, which was pitched, I believe, in 1919. Again, it was revived in 1924. The report failed to acknowledge that this was a plan that was also concocted by the Europeans. There were other plans in place, which the report did not mention. And one of them, to make this short, has to do with another plan which was invented by Forbes Barnum after 1964 to import West Indians into Guyana, in a sense to boost up his electoral support. The other factor which this report mentioned is the winner-take-all electoral system in Guyana's racially polarized space. Now, this report, when you look at the narrative, it continues a false narrative. Of course, there are concerns, and we have had this discussion with David and Vincent in the past about the problems with this electoral system that we have. But it ignores the fact that Indians are not a majority in Guyana, right? So that configuration has changed. Indians in 1980 was about almost 52%, and thanks to the PNC, that number has been reduced. We are still waiting for the, for the census to come out. And my guess is you're probably going to see maybe Indians are less than 40%. So that configuration, that number, will change. Obviously, I mean, it has changed from when you look at the 2015 election and 2020 election. It changed the way in which parties can be elected. It's not a majoritarian rule system anymore. So I'm going to end by saying this, that the report itself is inflammatory. If you're going to use the word dangerous, there is some dangerous element that is found in that report, and I've pointed out at least two of them. We can have a discussion about that. But again, what I'm saying here is that I don't have a problem with African Guyanese, and I think none of us have that issue, articulating, their positions, their concerns. That's a natural phenomenon. The other thing that hopefully we can discuss is there is also a perception in these reports that the PPP is gung-ho on creating a system where Indians dominate. And that's a fact that I will question, and I've questioned it before, because there is a natural assumption that the PPP represents Indian interests. I'm going to leave it at that.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ramarak. Mr. Dev, so Dr. Ramarak was saying just now about what Epology has written, and specifically on the issue of they say Hindu nationalism, and in the part where they talk about that, they quote you in your writing about black man and coolie man, the roots of prejudice, and they have a quote from you on explaining Indian attitudes. And given that you were directly quoted by Epology, I wonder, well, first how you feel about that, whether they just selectively quoted you or if that was accurate representation, and what do you think about how they label or define Hindu nationalism with respect to Guyanese politics or Guyanese attitudes?
I think what happened here is that there was a lot of cherry picking, which you normally see in these kind of reports, you cherry pick statements. So coming back to the exact statement that was pulled from something I must have written way back, I can't even find it in my own archives, is that for what was quoted, it says that the Indians reacted to what was there and developed their own prejudices. And that's the point. And this is where we need to be fair to the different groups in the society, which is that by the time Indians were brought into Guyana, and without any question to undercut African bargaining power that they had initiated in the 1840s, they had already been something called Creole culture formed, meaning they were the premises of Creole culture, which is that to the extent you had adopted English values, you had adopted English modes of dress, English modes of speech, going to school, going to church, to the extent that you did that, you were seen as quote unquote civilized, even by those Africans who had been hegemonized into thinking like that. That was their premise. So when the Indians were dumped in with their tattered clothing and their willingness to work in the fields and all that, they were derided as being pagan, as being heathen, as being uncivilized, as being miserly for saving and what have you. So there was these stereotypes tossed around from both sides, and Dr. Rodney has done a good job in describing these stereotypes, because very frequently the stereotypes were a repetition of what the Europeans would have categorized us, so that for Africans to not work in that manner that they had to work during slavery, they were called lazy. So that then was picked up by other groups in the society, and that stereotype persists, and I would say on to today. The Indians then, those who came, they were not philosophers or what have you. So in trying to deal with the kind of scorn that was posed and presented to them as to their being, they reacted what they know. And at that stage in the Indian life, caste was no question a very powerful force. All scholars, including Moore, has now said that that has dissipated. And so, for example, the anecdote I gave of some Indians looking at Africans and creating a myth of them being the people from Lanka and so on, I would hazard a guess that not 10 Guyanese who are living today understand that kind of background. The bottom line is, and I've said this, that in colonialism, it was based on Europeans defining the black man out of Africa to justify his enslavement and what they did to them in the plantations, that they were subhuman, and that became a very coherent narrative that they crafted. And to the extent that that European quote-unquote civilization spread across the world, we see people as foreign to us as the Koreans, the Chinese, the Ukrainians, the Russians. They all view Africans in that particular manner. So it goes beyond our particularity in Guyana to say it is Hindu ideology that dominates. There's a whole Western hegemony that still persists. So when we still study Shakespeare, Shakespeare has a particular view of Africans and who's a Moor and who is not. So I want to say that again, we have to be careful about the peculiarities of Guyana. That is not just about Africans. Africans are living with these other groups, and we can't play fast and loose with their reality too. So, for example, I'll cite one example to make my point, and I'll conclude, which is on Amerindians, our native people. The Ipadaji report talks about them getting X amount of land through laws that are reparative in nature, to make up for how they were treated. But that is absolutely not so. And any historian of any caliber would not say that. When going back to Dutch times, the Dutch had treaties with our Amerindians. And those treaties, they worked on those treaties and made payments to these Amerindians. And the Amerindians provide that service of catching enslaved people who had escaped the plantations. That was a known fact. It happened in 1762 in my part of the country at Iflap. There was 1772, there was a rebellion, and Amerindians were used to capture the enslaved people who participated. So the British adopted in totality as part of their acquiring of Guyana from the Dutch, the treaties, that they would continue with what they inherited from the Dutch. So those treaties were recognized as international treaties, and upon independence, when Mr. Burnham went up to London, along with him went Stephen Campbell, an Amerindian member of Parliament. And in the bargaining that went on, as part of the independence constitution that Mr. Burnham accepted, there is an Annex C, which talks about giving title to the lands that the Amerindians had held since the term is from time immemorial, which is just a term of art. It doesn't mean you got to go back to, caveman days. It meant that you're occupying it, for a long time. So the land that are being given to the Amerindians, we must be fair to our own history and to their own history. And I think that's an example of what I'm trying to say, that in each of the four groups trying to elbow in and to get justice and fairness and all of that, they must be cognizant to not deny the truth of other groups' concerns and positions.
Thank you, Mr. Dev. Now, Dr. Hines, I'm sure you have a lot to say in response to what Dr. Ramarak or Mr. Dev would have said just now, but I also want to, I'll ask you for your response, and I'll give you a chance to also add on. Mr. Dev mentioned just now briefly in passing Dr. Rodney, and you are, Dr. Hines, a member of the WPA or represent the WPA. I wonder, as we talk about race relations, ethnic relations, in the U.S., you may often ask, okay, how close are we to Dr. King's dream? Dr. Rodney of the WPA once had a great dream about multi-ethnic working class coalition. In that sense, I wonder, as we talk about race relations now, how close or far do you think we are from that dream of Dr. Rodney, and how alive or not it is?
Thanks for the question, but in fairness, these programs, whenever we get a chance to speak, we take up a good chunk of time. And in fairness to Mr. Jonas, it's his turn to go after. So I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to deny Mr. Jonas his turn.
Yeah. I was going to go to Mr. Jonas next, but yeah, this is I called to you anyways. You just gonna, and then I'll go to Mr. Jonas. Dr. Hines?
Yes, you still want me to go?
Yeah, and then I'll go to Mr. Jonas.
Okay. Look, Dr. Rodney's dream was no different from the dream of Mr. Burnham and Dr. Jagan and all of that. I think this thing about situating Dr. Rodney as though he's so different from the rest of us. No. His dream was the dream of coffee, the dream of all the leaders that came after. How far are we from that dream? Far away. We're far away. And this thing about making Dr. Rodney so exceptional, and so on. He was exceptional as an individual, and he inspired a generation of people, including myself and so on. But to try to locate him outside of the larger mix, I think, is a disservice to him. Look, I want to bring back the conversation to the decade. That this is a decade that is dedicated to people of African descent. There was a decade dedicated to people of Amerindians. And I'm sure that at some point, there should be a decade that is dedicated to other ethnic groups. And I don't think that we should deny ourselves the opportunity to deal with the African question. And we should not try to, I do not disagree with any of the things that are said here, but this is a question of the particularity of the African experience in our mix. And that the United Nations has recognized that this experience, given the particularity of the experience of enslavement, which was not experienced by other ethnic groups in Guyana. Ravidev talks about the particularity of the Amerindian experience, and he's quite correct. And there's a particularity of the Indian experience, and the Chinese and the Portuguese. And there's a particularity of the African experience that other ethnic groups did not experience. And that is the center of what the United Nations is asking us to deal with, 1. 2, this is not a question of Indian people or Amerindian people. The decades is about the responsibility of the government and the state. It is the government and the state that stepped in to deal with the Amerindian question. And what the United Nations is saying, the government and the state should step in and deal with the African question. And I think somewhere down the line, the state and the government will have to deal with the Indian and Chinese and Portuguese question. You see? So this is about the responsibility of the state to deal with the scars of bondage of African people, the scars of bondage of all groups. But the scars of African are particular to African people, given their particular experience of enslavement. And I think if we cannot sit on a panel like this and to start our conversation by saying the African experience was unique, and so therefore there needs to be a unique treatment. You mentioned Dr. Rodney, he never shirked from that responsibility. People make him into a non-African, and he didn't deal with African question. You know, he has a little book called From Nigger Yard to Village, in which he deals with the question of what, if the people who wrote that government report had read Rodney's From Nigger Yard to Village, they wouldn't write such a report. My brother here talks about, Brother Betaram talks about inflammatory in pedagogy, but the government response is fair. Fair from whose perspective? From his perspective, not from the African perspective. What Betaram and Ravi and Mr. Jonas and I need to do is to put ourselves in the shoes of African. That's what we are discussing here tonight. Padagy's report is inflammatory, maybe from an Indian standpoint, but we're not talking about the Indian issue here tonight. We're talking about the African condition. And the Africans would not see it as inflammatory, and the Africans would not see the government report as fair. So we have to start with what is before us. Now, what is motivating the government in Guyana? Padagy is saying that there are elements of Hindu nationalism that is motivating them. Whether that is true or not is debatable. But the fact of the matter here, we're not interrogating Hindu nationalism and the caste system. What we're interrogating is the government's action or inaction in dealing with the conditions of African people. And I think that's where the conversation has to be. If we don't carry the conversation there, then we are just circling the wagon and not really getting in to the teeth of the matter. At some point, we'll have to talk about the Indian experience and the Chinese and Portuguese experience, that experience of indentureship. But it cannot be spoken of in any serious and analytical way when we lump it together with the African experience. At some point when we finish with the Amerindian experience and the African experience and the experiences of the other group, then we have to have a conversation about how we pull all of these together to talk about a Guyanese trajectory. But to deny Africans this decade, and this decade to have a conversation about their experience in Guyana and how they see it, and what are the responsibilities of the government, really, I think, is insultive to Black people.
Thank you, Dr. Hines, for your contribution. Now, Mr. Jonas, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to what was just said by your fellow panelists. Any thoughts you may have?
I want to thank Ravi for his comments and his attempt at cutting through the chaff and getting to where we should be. I agree with Dr. Hines to this extent. If we are to implement a system that is fair, that trajectory, to use his word, must consider everybody. You cannot implement a system to be fair by considering only one part of the society to the exclusion of another part of the society. That's not going to work. Now, this conversation started when Mr. Dev made this remark, and I want to respectfully agree with this remark. You cannot use the same brush to paint the South African experience, the American experience, the English experience, and the Guyanese experience. You can't. South Africa went through a horrendous system of apartheid that is in the memory of us all. It's within our lifetime. I knew about it. I remember when Guyanese cricketers were castigated because they went to play in South Africa after it was decided that we would boycott South Africa. This is within our lifetime. And in South Africa, the remnants of that, notwithstanding more than 20 years since Mandela has come into power, died, and there's been a reversal of fortunes in South Africa, so that the people who should be running South Africa at long last are running South Africa. But we still remember, and in South Africa, the society still remembers. You can't compare that to Guyana. In America, where the wealth is controlled, not 50% or 60% or 70%, all the wealth is controlled by one group. And the Afro-American is marginalized to an extent that is only since the 1960s he didn't have to sit at the back of the bus. There are Afro-Americans who remember that, and they are still marginalized. Now, they have their issue. They can't be compared to South Africa, but none of them can be compared to us. Because here in our lovely country, you have a group of minorities. They are all minorities. Thank God they are all minorities. And therefore, no African can remember sitting at the back of the bus. And no Indian can remember sitting at the back of the bus. The one issue in common, which is a safe red herring, a safe scapegoat, is these terrible colonial masters. Let me tell you, I am aware that I can trace my family back to slavery in Guyana. My grandfather's name was Ronald Murphy. He is the youngest son, and his grandfather was born in slavery. I'm aware, I can tell you that. I was never a slave, and no colonial master ever oppressed me. So when I hear someone say that they need some special consideration because they are a part of a group that was enslaved 200 years ago in Guyana, I want to distance myself from that because I'm aware of my oppressors. My oppressors were the PNC government, the PPP government, the APNU government, and again, the PPP government. Those are my oppressors. Those are the organizations that have made us second poorest to Haiti. Those are the organizations that began to misspend and mismanage free oil money. And that's what we have to talk about. Now, I agree that there needs to be a system that is fair to everybody. But unless we can have an honest discussion on what makes the system unfair now, we'll go nowhere. And this is what I'll tell you. And this is the truth. When you read the EPADA G report, it has elements of truth. And when you read the PPP response, it has elements of truth. And the elements of truth are curiously similar. The winner-take-all system of government allowed Burnham, under his rigged regime, to put his people in charge of sugar when he nationalized it, to create the Guyana Rice Development Board, which monopolized the purchase of rice from Indian rice farmers, the rice industry being largely Indo, to resell at export at a huge profit, and therefore both rice and sugar were harmed. All foreigners left with nationalization, and the economy had disastrous consequences. All of that's true, and all of that was permissible in a state where the laws were fair. There were no discriminatory laws that say you got to sit at the back of the bus or that you can't live in that house. But the implementation of the laws by the political party that had all the power in the winner-take-all system allowed them to implement systems that were favorable to their own. So that the housing schemes that you look at from the 70s and 80s, from wealth, go and look and see who lives there. The personnel who were installed to run sugar, to run the GRDB, to run the public service, to run the army, to run the police, to run everything in the 70s and 80s, look and see who it was. And then flip it, and the kettles come into power. And when the kettles come into power, there still are no discriminatory laws that say you sit at the back of the bus. But in the award of contracts, it goes to our people. And all of those PNC people that were installed in all of those positions are fired. And our people are put in to replace them. So the GRDB is now housed by our people. Rice Producers Association now housed by our people. The money diverted for the benefit of our people. Contracts awarded to our people. Then in 2015, the kettle got back into power. And all of our people got thrown out. And all of their people got put in. And then in 2020, the pots came back in. When are we going to realize that if we keep trying to distract attention from what is real and what is immediately in front of our face, we will never get to the truth and never get to a solution?
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. To follow up on what you were saying, then I was thinking about following up on it earlier as well. So the IPADA writings, they also, as you mentioned, they talk about the winner-take-all system. Now, given your role with that, I'll just say, in my personal opinion, I think that you are probably the most talented third-party political figure I've seen in Guyana, in at least since Mr. Ravidev before. I think that I wonder, what are your opinions with how reports like these could help potentially spark discussion about electoral reform in Guyana? Or do you think, for example, the talk about race relations aspect of it overshadows that? To what extent do you think that this can lead to discussion about electoral system reform?
That's such an interesting question, and I thank you for it. I want to be clear about something. In our beautiful country, first of all, there are two types of racism, and I want to invite you to think about the definition that I've been coming up with, having over the last 5 years dealt with society in Guyana at the political level. The first version of racism is where I think I'm better than you, because class, skin color, whatever, I think I'm better than you. So I won't sit down and eat at the same table with you because you're a lower class or a lower caste. The second form of discrimination is where I make an assumption that you think you're better than me. I assume a victim role. Now, in Guyana, I don't think there's very much of the first type. In Guyana, everybody will sit down and eat at the table with everybody else. We'll go to a bottom house wedding, I'll sit down in the masjid, at a funeral, I will partake anywhere. And I have never had the experience of being excluded. But I am aware that in Guyana, the second form of racism is quite prevalent. That we look at the people on the other side and assume things about them, assume they're racist, assume they have hostile views of us. We take a victim approach. And I think that is the big danger that we have. Now, the reason that people vote how they vote is not that because they're racist. We are an example to the world when it comes to racism. We live harmoniously by and large. But we do make the assumption, and we are taught by the other generation above, that those people can't be trusted. And if those people are running the country, we will be marginalized and excluded. And if those people run the country, we won't get jobs. So we are taught to fear those people. And that is why the political divide is as sharp and crisp as it is. Now, for the first time, as my friend Dr. Bertram has said, The Indo-Guyanese population does not have a clear majority. For the first time, the demographic is changing, and therefore there's a lot of worry going on. But look how the two sides accuse each other. One side accuses the other and says, man, y'all changed the rules, you're not allowing Haitians to come in the country. The other side says, y'all had some policy to try to bring Indians in from India and Sri Lanka. Now they're saying they're allowing Venezuelans to come in. So everything is viewed suspiciously. How are we going to change this demographic to our advantage? That is how sad our political environment has become, because it has nothing to do with merit. And to answer your question, I think that the role of any third party must be to get rid of the winner-take-all system by ensuring that whichever of those two, the pots or the kettles, whichever one wins, they win with a minority government, so that the kettles, if they're in opposition, control parliament, or the pots, if they're in opposition, control parliament. That way, we have a chance to stop the criticisms that are made truthfully by both sides. When Ipadaji says all of these Afro-Guyanese were thrown out of their positions in 2020, it's the truth. But what Ipadaji doesn't say is all those Afro-Guyanese were installed into those positions in 2015, when Indo-Guyanese were removed from those positions. And that is also the truth. Now you put opposition to control parliament, and you can immediately implement laws to say that if you have a government-owned entity, such as GPL, such as Chronicle, such as the radio station, such as Guywa, the board of directors of that entity cannot be appointed solely by the minister, as is done now, thus allowing Burnham to take over Gaisuko, thus allowing Burnham to take over the GRDB, and then PPP taking it over after 1992. The opposition in Parliament can pass laws to mandate that 2 members of the board shall be opposition, 1 shall be third party, and 2 shall be government. Then we can have fair decisions. We can have people employed in those entities, not because they're friends with the minister, but because they deserve it by virtue of their qualifications and merit. And they have the luxury of knowing they can't be fired because the politicians don't like them. Once they do their job, they will have the backing of at least 3 people on that board. We can change where the rot truly is, where the corruption truly is, by a sensible, intelligent, competent, and well-organized majority opposition in Parliament. That's the only way to do it, or else winner-take-all will continue, and the trend will continue.
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. Now, I have a quick follow-up to you, and then I will go around the panel with this particular question, as well as any thoughts the panelists may have to what Mr. Jonas just said. Now, we have these UN forums with Ipadaji. You have the UN Human Rights Committee report. You have all these international organization involvement in Guyana in the sense of dialogue. But in terms of actual changes on the ground, or how long-term or short-term the impact of that dialogue may be, I want to direct that topic to the panel now. Do you see this this issue actually penetrating the Guyanese political discourse, or do you think that this is something that will just fade away? Is this something that, say, in the run-up to the expected elections in 2025, that you think political figures will be talking about in Guyana, or is this just going to be something that we talk about for a few days? It's in the news cycle now, and it eventually just moves on. So briefly, Mr. Jones, and then we'll just go around back on the panel with that.
Rusat, my friend Hines just made the point, and he was right, that it's easy for one person to monopolize. I just spoke for too long. You want to continue with me?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was just going to get you quick and then move back, but I'll move on to Dr. Hines then.
No, Betoram.
Betoram. And then
I was trying to switch up the order sometimes. I don't necessarily do the same. the same 1, 2, 3, 4, same 1, 2, 3, 4. I'd like to spice it up, but okay, I'll go with Dr. Ramar.
All right, so I'm not sure which question I'm responding to though, but let me just say, sometimes we have to take a step backwards and put ourselves in the feet of the other person. So maybe that may be a good thing, for Indians and Africans. So I would have to say that on that basis, I do agree. I don't normally agree with a lot of things Timothy says, but on this point that he makes, I do agree that when you look at situation in Guyana, obviously there are two competing sides, right? And until we fix this problem, we're gonna be saddled with this issue, for a long time to come. I mean, you look at David, myself, Mr. Dev, we're moving on in age, and we have been talking about this problem.
But I think you all look very good.
Say again?
I think you all look very good. I don't think anybody in the audience could tell that at all.
Well, I don't think anybody looks as good as David, but be that as it may, so we have been, and Timothy also has been at this issue, trying to come up with solutions to this issue for as long as we can remember. And we have been consistent, I have to say that, in what we say. And everything we've done is in the public domain. But I do believe also that we have to have multiple narrative that at some point, must meet at a point. It's like the river deltas meeting at a certain point where we can have that one national narrative. And I don't agree with everything, that the PPP has said in terms of what they had presented to the UN. And we have been very clear about, things like, people getting shot in the dead of night by police officers and so on. Those are things that should not be happening in a country like Guyana. So I don't want to sound like I'm totally, supporting one side of the equation. There are problems and issues that have to be fixed, right? But I think we are in a better place. I don't know if everybody will agree with me on this. We are in a better place today compared to where we were before. And what I said about the Ipadaji report, I still believe that the language does not take into consideration that we are living in a multiracial society. And I think that's the point that Timothy was alluding to. I'll give you an example. There's a statement in there that says, we're looking at 400 years of anti-African discrimination, 400 years, which ends in 2021. So you're now telling me that, okay, well, what happened to the 28 years, right, when the PNC was in office? So do we now excise that? And there are other things that I know this is not maybe a forum where we can discuss, but it's also connected because we're talking about a narrative. I know David says, well, okay, this is about the decade of the people of African descent, but the point is the narrative, has implications because you're also trying to change public policy. And if that narrative says, as we have discussed before, that we have to recognize those 400 years of discrimination, and of course, reparations has to be allocated to address those grievances. Now, you're also saying that if the discrimination ends in 2021, that the current regime, right, which has now discovered resources, that resources should also be used to address issues of reparation. A better argument, as I've said before, would be to say that the resources we have now should be used to promote equity, right? Equity in resource distribution and so on. And that's a better way to go. But I think Ipadaji takes the position that reparation should also come from the current government, because they don't see a different government from the time that Africans were brought to Guyana. In other words, there's a continuity, so to speak. The state is a state, as the saying goes. So my point is that, it's not just a narrative. It's a narrative that as Mr. Dev says, I do believe that it's selective in its wording. in its language. And I think that is probably the reason why you see the response that is given from the government side. So we still have that divide. We're not moving beyond that. But let me just say this. I don't know when that situation will occur that Timothy is imagining. And I think that will be the perfect nirvana, where we can live in a society that is harmonious. I don't know which society is like that, by the way, but the point is, hopefully we'll get to that point. But we have also recommended, we have made a recommendation in the meantime that there are certain institutional changes, regardless of how you describe racism and discrimination. And again, we have been on record saying that there are a number of institutional changes, and I can just mention a couple of them: affirmative action, to address issues of discrimination, resource allocation, and so on. We've talked about institutional changes that reflect the population of Guyana. We've talked about having an ethnic caucus, which can articulate ethnic concerns and make sure those concerns are known to the government. We've talked about balancing in institutions. One of the things that I keep pointing out to people is that this government may not necessarily work in that direction simply because they don't see the issue of ethnicity and race as a major concern that has to be addressed. It goes back again to the whole notion of Guyana is a divided society on the basis of class, right? So this is why I keep saying, and people raise their eyebrows, not just one eyebrow, but both of them, that the PPP does not represent and articulate an Indian perspective in the sense that the Ipadaji report suggests. And I can cite some examples, but again, that's a discussion, I guess, for another time.
Thank you, Dr. Ramarek. I was going to say on a lighter note, so Dr. Ramarek said that Mr. Jonas's vision is almost like a nirvana. So, the next time somebody says that people are trying to make Guyana the next Dubai, you could say Mr. Jonas envisions the next nirvana. But I'll move on to Mr. Ravidev to give some remarks on what was just said, and also, in terms of what Ipadaji said, we touched on it earlier. This Hindu nationalism that was claimed. I wonder if you just want to tackle head on, whether you think that's even an applicable phrase to Guyana, because the PP, or because I would know many people who would say that phrase is not accurate at all. I just want to know what your opinion on that would be, and I'll have a follow-up after that.
Well, I wouldn't want to waste time on that. I think it's a red herring, and most of the people in the PPP wouldn't understand Hinduism, Hindu nationalism, if it crept up and bite them on their behind. I'll tell you that. I'll tell you, when I was in politics and in parliament, very senior members of the PPP, people don't forget I was on the opposition side all 5 years, and they used to mock me. Hey Pandit, hey Pandit. Because to be a Pandit obviously was a derisive term, you're somehow backward. So I wouldn't go down that road. To me, it's totally irrelevant. I want to come back to where do we go? Again, not to get personal, but I quit whatever I had in New York. I'm reminded of this because I'm back in New York. I'm taking care of some medical problems. But the point is that 35
we wish you all the best and speedy recovery.
35 years I've been back in Guyana, quit my job, quit everything back there, trying to grapple with this question, because I come out of a mixed village of Iflat. And in fact, I've been doing a lot of research into my village, which started in 1767. And, we have an African portion, an Indian portion. And in trying to understand that history, just give me a perspective that I think, because it's grounded in people who I know. You know, I know my friend Bourne, who I went to school with. I know that, you know, we would eat together, sleep together, bathe together, fight together, whatever. And then suddenly came this riot and split us, and the two has never really come together again. So my concern in those 35 years I've been back in Guyana to see how can we do that. And I've tried any number of things that are still being put on the table. So I'm not saying, you know, you shouldn't retry things, but take, for example, this beating up on David Icaries. When I came back, David Icaries offered me a column in the Stabroek News to speak on politics from an Indian perspective. Yet, you know, he's being beaten up as a, you know, colored elite or what have you. Well, he was colored. Jonas is colored objectively, but it depends on what you do in terms of vis-a-vis Guyana. You're interesting, you know. And as ironic was that I once wanted to produce a Hindu supplement for Shivratri because I'd gone to Kovenjan for many years, and there were at least 20,000 people every year passing through Kovenjan Ashram on Shivratri. So I asked David, man, can we run a supplement? I'll pay for it, of course. And he said, no, well, talk. I don't make those kind of decisions. Talk to my wife, who happened to be an Indian. And she told me, absolutely not. You know, no, go print it on yourself. And I took up the challenge and went to Trinidad every month and printed a newspaper called Jahaji for many months. But to come back to it, the United Nations, in which, you know, Ipadaji has placed its trust and is trying to get some form of justice. I want to be blunt about this. The United Nations started out in 1945 on some particular premises, and it was sold to us as how it is above the fray. But we know every institution in the United Nations system, the decks are stacked. And that's why if anybody's looking for justice to be done in Guyana by the UN, should look what's happening in Gaza, you know, on the Gaza Strip. You know, let's not get too carried away. I always supported multilateralism. It gave us a voice, but a voice for what? When 5 nations can veto whatever you want at any given time. So I want to come back to it is we people in Guyana, those of us who have formed this state called Guyana, we have to resolve it ourselves. And I've said this very many times again, that when I got into parliament, we took a position to be an Indian party. After Mr. David Hines, we sat in this Cara Lodge restaurant, I think it's called the Bottle Lodge. And I asked David, I said, man, we form a party together. We'll, you know, it'll be multiracial and all that. David explained his own circumstances and his own responsibilities. So Roar became, you know, an Indian party to make a particular point, which was that we're going to, people call themselves multiracial, but the PNC, in the form of Mr. Hoyt, didn't see himself as African, to speak it. They played this game. Similarly, the PPP played this game. So we did it was like we're going to say that the emperor has no clothes. We are an Indian party, then deal with this. You understand? Deal with this. So when we talked about the killings and all that was going on in 2000, right? We said, well, who's responsible? And when we voted for an inquiry, ironically, we voted with the PNC. The PNC wanted an inquiry into those killings. You know, we talked about Sash Saw Mort. I heard of it the other day in the press, one of their sons. I sat next to Robert Corbyn during his funeral, and Corbyn was furious, you know, for what was being said officially in terms of who's responsible and who are the intellectual authors. But I want to come back to where I started. We have to solve this thing ourselves. And my problem with the Ipadaji report is that I think it is taking our business out to outsiders, but not giving credit to all the other groups. I know it's an African forum, and I know we got to make, but we can't make our case by putting down others in the society. You will have an immediate reaction as to what has happened in the racism and other. It'll be a action and reaction, and we'll never get out of it. So take, for example, the point that Africans don't own as much land as Indians, right? Where the statement by Ipadoji is that the contract that Indians were given, when you added up 12 acres and the majority of them took that land, never happened. A PhD dissertation proved that by Dr. Leslie Potter from McGill University. And you know, I have quoted these figures. Only 3% of the Indians who remained, 3%, exchanged, they weren't given land, exchanged their guaranteed return passage for land. So when Ipadoji talks about, to me, a valid concern of African not owning lands, but now, in a sense, says, hey, these Indians got land. I think it's, or these Amerindians got land, which Ipadoji did. And I've said this personally to David on other occasions. I think we are muddying up the waters. I think the claims of African Guyanese ought to be made as is. So, and we have called for something called an ethnic impact statement. And I'll conclude here, which is that every project or every initiative by the government should have an ethnic impact. How will it affect ethnically? Because that is how it will be dissected afterwards. Whether we like it or not, that's where we are right now, as to where we ought to be, which is what Jonas is talking about. We're not there yet, so we have to start from where we are. And then let us talk about the ethnic impact. Jonas talks about the kinds of racism. Well, being up from American trained lawyer, in America we talk about, you know, the direct racism that you talk about having motive and I hate this person, but there's something called adverse impact, which is also defined as racism, which is if a policy affects a particular group out of proportion with their numbers and with their availability, meaning they have to have somehow put your hand up and say, two, you know how. If then there's an adverse impact, and the state is then compelled to look into why. So, for example, Afro-Guyanese. Let's talk about not getting loans, and I'll conclude here. In Guyana, to have a bank license, the Bank of Guyana's regulations are very clear and, in fact, very simple. When I returned to Guyana, you know, Riasu Prasad was one of those persons I was involved with, and I knew of the discussions when the Demerara Bank was formed. I think you have to have $2 million US in capital, and you have to have individuals who will be running the bank with a particular background check. They have to be qualified. So there are some hoops you have to jump through. But anyone can open a bank in Guyana, including African Guyanese, and nobody is stopping them. So not having a bank isn't because of any discrimination. It might be due to other factors, and that's what I would say we need to look into. Because there's no question that other groups are participating to a higher level than an African Guyanese in several sectors of the committee. But I got a figure recently from the last census, which shows me, and I was surprised, I must say, pleasantly surprised, that African Guyanese home ownership percentage is higher than Indians. To me, was very heartening if the government ever allowed that figure to come out. So we need hard facts. We need some policies like ethnic impact statements so that we can go forward. Thank you for that's my contribution.
Thank you, Mr. Dr. Hines. I'll give you your opportunity to respond to anything from the fellow panelists that you want to respond to, and then after that we'll go into closing remarks. Bless you.
Yes, there's quite a lot here. No, this discussion here tonight proves the United Nations Special Committee on the People of African Descent correct. Brother Jonas says there are no laws saying black people sit at the back of the bus. There are no laws that say the black people shouldn't get contract, but they don't get contract. in spite of the laws, all right? And that is what the United Nations said. They said, look, you know, our laws against discrimination, we have moved on at the level of the laws, at the level of the Constitution. But at the level of the sociology, we have not moved on. And I think where we fell short tonight, and I hope we have a follow-up, is where we begin to look at the sociology of race. Move beyond the formalities of the laws and the Constitution and winner take all and minorities. All that happens when we know a nation of minorities, we become a nation of election thieves, because none of them has a majority, and all of them would want to secure a majority by thieving the election. So what we are hailing as a positive thing, we no longer have an ethnic majority. For me, it's a negative thing, because the PNC rigged in the first place because they saw themselves as an ethnic minority. And the PPP is rigging the hell out of the elections like the PNC now because they see themselves as an ethnic minority. If you scratch there behind us, Rafi said, and you know, show them Hindu nationalism, they wouldn't recognize it. But I'm telling you, Rafi, they benefit from it. And they know they benefit from Hindu nationalism. And the PNC benefits from black nationalism without calling themselves black nationalists. So let's be real, right? Let's be real here, all right? No. Here is and I'm interested in Jonas, right? Because like I said, Ravi and Betaram and I have been tangling with this thing for a thing. Now, Jonas starts his history at independence, all right? And then he asks, when are we going to stop this thing, right? And he talks about the pot and the kettle, right? But there's also a saucepan that was there before 1966, all right? The colonialists, all right? And yes, Mr. Jonas, there are people who remember sitting at the back of the bus during colonialism not too long ago. In fact, some of them couldn't get onto the bus, all right? No, of course Guyana is not South Africa. Of course Guyana is not the United States. But what each of those countries has in common is black people. And there's a common experience. I've gone to South Africa. I live in the United States. I live in Guyana. And there are more similarities than differences in the experience. You take that from me, all right? Take that from me, all right? And so therefore, it is not so much that we are taking things from other places and imposing it on Guyanese. It's trying to tease out the larger experience and what that means. And I go back, this is not about Indian people. In fact, when Ipadaji references Indian people having more land or Amerindian people having more land, it's not to say they shouldn't have them. They should, and they should have more. But black people also should have. And that the fact that black people don't have has to do with policies that were enacted immediately after enslavement, and that the post-colonial governments have not corrected. And what the United Nations are saying is that you have to correct those mistakes that were made in the past, and mistakes that have affected all ethnic groups, right? It has affected African people more because of that history, and that history which Brother Jonas doesn't want to deal with. He started with the kettle and the pots in 1966, you know. But to understand the kettle and the pot and the authoritarianism of the kettle and the pot, that authoritarianism has its roots in the colonial authoritarianism. So that at independence we changed the flag and the constitution, right? But Burnham and Jagan and them adopt all the things that they learned from the colonialists. So what you're calling the PNC and the PPP authoritarianism, as Clive Thomas argued so wonderfully in his book, The Rise of the Authoritarian State in the Periphery, they have their roots in the authoritarianism of slavery and colonialism. And I submit that, look, putting a nation back together, when you take the circumstances in which we came to Guyana, our Amerindian brothers and sisters were here before, but the rest of us came later. And the circumstances in which we came, and the circumstances under which we relate to each other, to try to put us together as a nation is a daunting task. And sometimes we beat ourselves up because we think there is something about Indian people and Black people and so on that is wrong, that we can't come together and so on. I think it was Jonas who said that, you know, compared to people in the world, we are doing well on race relations, all right? But as David Rudder said, how we party is not how we vote. I think what we sometimes talk about is the way we party and not the way we vote, and not recognizing that that partying and voting, meaning the sociology and the politics, are equally important. And I think if we create a government to manage the state, a government to manage the state that is representative in aspirations of all our people, I think that's the way to start. And hence, my support for a broad, I don't want to use the word power sharing anymore because it suggests that you want to share somebody's power, you know? And I don't want Indians to share Black people power, and Black people to share Indian people power. Is that for all of the groups to share the burden of managing this difficult polity, this difficult society that we have inherited, all right? And I think that's where we have to go. And if we get down now to the business of trying to cobble together a majority, so if you're the PPP and you have 40% Indians and all you need is 5% Amerindians and 5% Black people, and you get 5% Black people and you say, oh, I am national, what about the 95% that you don't get? What about the 95%? They're going to derail you, they're going to undermine you, and you are not going to be able to manage the state. You're going to get more reports from the Itpadaji. If Itpadaji dies tomorrow, another Itpadaji going to come up. And trust me, they're going to be Indian Itpadajis that are going to come up very shortly. We have to deal with that reality. And the thing is to try to construct a government that is going to manage the state on behalf of all its people. And we cannot do that by striving for this bare majority, because now we know you can rig a majority just by clicking your finger. We have 200 and odd extra people on a list, a voters list. All you need is 5,000 for a majority. And we have export electoral thieves in Guyana on both sides of the kettle and the pot. Export electoral thieves. And what 2020 showed is, boy, they could do it. As I heard Jonas on another program said, well, if you ask them to prove that Mingo tried to rig election, you can't prove it, but you know it. And if you try to ask the other side to prove that all them boxes, 47 boxes, they fiddle with a new vote, not in the country, and think they can prove it because they did a dangerous thing, to use Jonas' thing. They opened the boxes before the election ended. And so the other side has a case. You catch me thieving, and in trying to prove that I thief, you open a can of worms, which shows that you've been thieving all along. Two thieves make God laugh. In this instance, two thieves make God cry.
Thank you, Dr. Hines. I'll go into closing statements from all of you. I'll begin with Dr. Ramarak.
Well, let me just, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've always said that the problem in Guyana, the ethnic problem, the racial problem, whatever you want to call it, has to be solved by the people who live there, right? And I think, I like what David said about there has to be at some point an Indian epatagy, but I'm hopeful, and I've been hoping for a long time to see that happen, so we can have our voice articulated and represented. And I say that not to sound triumphalist, but I think the conversation, as Jonas is saying, has to go on all sides, right? And I think when you get to a point where you can have that conversation, everybody can freely talk about the kind of narrative about who they are, just the way we are speaking here, right? About race in Guyana. It's unusual, I can tell you, among Indians to have this kind of discussion, intense discussion. And I don't mean that as a put down, but I think if we can get to a point where we can see that happen, where we have the narrative from one side and the narrative from the other side, maybe at that point we can have a national narrative that speaks to all Guyanese, right? Which is really, I think, where we want to get to. But in the meantime, we're not there yet, but we've suggested some ways, some means, and some mechanism by which we can use to ameliorate the contentious politics which we have in Guyana. And I think David is right. We need to have a continued discussion about this. And I appreciate the fact that I would say again, and I will end here by saying that we do need an epology from an Indian perspective, because I really feel that that voice from that side is not being heard. Now, yes, the PPP is the party of Indians, but the PPP does not speak, as I've said over and over again, for Indians. And there are many reasons for that. Maybe at some point we'll probably get a chance to discuss that. And I think that may be a part of the problem, but some people may see that as the way forward, because you're not looking at race and ethnicity as a problem. You're focusing on all of we being one. But to a certain extent, obviously, that ignores the central problem, the central variable in our politics that we have to recognize and deal with. So I will end there.
Thank you, Dr. Ramarak. Mr. Dev?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I just want to emphasize that, yeah, we need to understand it's not only the UN has become ineffectual and it's not going to be fixed. Something going to happen. They've now become the League of Nations. Totally ineffectual, not going to happen, and it's going to be a big joke. Sadly, in Guyana, and this is where I hear this plea for the two sides, PNC and the PPP, to come together for the quote-unquote good of the country and somehow share power together, not power sharing, but share power in running the state, to make that fine distinction that David made. But in 35 years, I have sat with both sides. I've sat with them, sit down with them. We had through something called, like what Jonas is trying to do, I call it a center force back in the day. And we had all of these small parties with big egos. And we tried to form a center force explicitly, to be between the two behemoths. And we tried every which way. And what I can say is that until those two parties, because of the nature of ethnic politics, where your identity is wrapped up with who leads the nation, because of how the nation has been defined as we think. You see, it's easy for Jonas to talk about it. He is mixed. He can go both sides. You understand? And he can take that perspective, and is well, I don't know how he deals with it. I mean, not to get personal, but I know his dad had great difficulty in being a colored man in Guyana. And, I remember back, at Queens, what happened and so on. So it wasn't easy being a colored person with the expectations at one time. That maybe has now dissipated. But the point is that we must understand that the two parties are not going to do it. We have seen both of them talk about constitutional change. My friend Nigel Hughes was put in charge of a constitutional committee to take, submissions. You got some very, very brilliant men. We Guyanese like to talk about be bright, they don't come brighter than Haslem Paris and Justice Pollard, and they were there. Didn't work, didn't happen. Report was given to Mr. Nagamoto, and it went to a black hole. And those of us who do science, nothing emerges from a black hole, So to come back to it, I think there has to be a movement by the people themselves. And this oil and its money will unleash a dynamic of its own in terms of people not having to grub for a living. And if we can get to our people, I think this kind of conversation at a grassroots level should continue. I am very disappointed in Padaji's memo, having known Vincent and having spent so much time with Vincent on this program, for it to take this one-sided approach, which automatically, and I wasn't surprised when others reacted in a particular way. Because if you will make all these assertions about other ethnic groups, which are untrue, they will react adversely to the very valid points you made in terms of, for example, what happened to African Guyanese in the post-emancipation period, right? So I would like to say that this discussion should go forward, but we should work on some ground rules, because those narratives is our shorthand in Guyana for our ideology. The age of ideology is not dead. So the narrative in our head, them coolie people do this to us, them get free land, them get free this, they get free that, and that is why we are here. You understand? And we got to be careful about our narratives. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Dev. Dr. Hines, I'll go to you, and then finally, Mr. Jonas.
You're insisting on skipping Jonas and coming to me.
No, right. it's just switching it up to keep the program interesting.
I agree with Ravi that this thing is not going to be solved by political parties. And that is why difficult societies like ours have to always look to walk on multiple planks at the same time. We can't ignore the two big parties. History has proven that. But we also have to find ways and means to work around them and sometimes work on their edges in order to bring our country to the point that we want to live in peace and not be so overly suspicious of each other. As regards Ipadaji, what Rafi's calling one-sided report, I will call an African Guyanese perspective. And it has to be one-sided. It's an African Guyanese perspective. What else you want them to say? Now, what is instructive is that if Ravidev and Betoram Ramarak as Roar or Jaguar had responded and written the report that the government wrote, I would not be making the same comments that I'm making. It is the government of all of us, which is responding to an organization of Black people and taking an Indianist position. So when my brothers say talk that PPP is not Indian, here is the government responding to an African Guyanese organization pushing an Indianist position. The government. This is not Ravidev and Betoram, right? If Ravidev and Betoram wrote that report, I will debate them on it, and my disposition will be different. But this is the government. This is the government of Guyana. Once it takes that oath, It's the government of all of the people. And it's writing an Indianist response. And then you tell me that they don't represent Indian people, they don't speak for Indian people. That is the highest defense of Indian people. That is that you are using the state. You're using the state to defend Indian interests. And that's my quarrel with the government report. When your government is saying that we have no responsibility to black people in business because they buy dilapidated estates and they plant food to eat rather than planting food to sell. So that's why they're in the position that they're in today. So the government is taking the position that black people are poor business people. What policies will flow from that assumption? The policies that will flow from that assumption is that you don't invest in them with business. You don't, you leave them to be that army of cheap labor for foreign companies to come in and take advantage of. And that's where the Hindu nationalism comes in. It is remnants of Hindu nationalism that is infecting those who are in charge of the government. They don't have to know it ideologically and philosophically. They know it bare, right? And so when the government says that black people enforce that black people are poor business people, then their policies are going to flow from that view. They're going to invest less in black people when it comes to business and invest more in Indian people and other ethnic groups. That is the danger of the government report that Betoram is calling fair. If it had come from Betoram and Ravi, I may be tempted to say yes. It's fair coming from Indian people, but it's coming from my government. And that's what I have a problem with, and that's what all of us should have a problem with.
Thank you, Dr. Hines. Dr. Hines, do you, I know it's a closing remark, but do you mind if I just ask a quick follow-up? Because I think it benefits the audience because yes, we're touching on certain issues, and I'm curious to how you would view it. So, say when you talk about the report, but when say Minister Walrond is participating in before the forum and giving those views, do you consider Minister Walrond as giving an Indian perspective from a PP government, or do you think I wonder? How do you view that?
She's given the government government perspective, and the government perspective is an Indian perspective, and this is the complexity of race. Race is not just phenotype. Race is also ideological. There's ideological race, right? So you can be African and taking a strong anti-African position. It may not be pro-Indian, but it may be a strong anti-African position. So there is ideological race, there is phenotypical race. So phenotypically, she's black, but ideologically and politically, she's not black. And so therefore, that's the position that she's taking. God bless her. I do not deny people of any ethnic group to join whatever party they want to join. You're free to do that. If I want to join a party, nobody can tell me what to join. And I want to say this in closing, that I know a lot of Indian people think that I'm a racist, but I have no place in my life, no place in my politics for an anti-Indian black nationalism. That people come to me and say, I don't like Indian people. And don't come to me with that. I am for black consciousness that is pro-black, not anti-Indian. If you're coming to me with an anti-Indian blackness, go somewhere else. I have absolutely no place in my politics for that.
Thank you, Dr. Hines. And just one quick follow-up that wasn't the Walrond part.
Rusat, sorry, we're really over time. If we could go to Mr. Jonas and close.
It's just we'll be done within like a few minutes. I mean, it's just there's a certain point, and because I don't want the audience to be left. So you were saying about Hindu nationalism and that you believe that the government, or at least that the party, is infected with Hindu nationalism to some extent. But so just to understand the view, do you believe that the president, is a Muslim? He's the first Muslim president of the country. You believe that he is, leading a government that is infected with Hindu nationalism?
You see, I don't want to get into the personality thing, because ethnicity and race is not about individuals. As individuals, we make choices across ethnic lines. We marry across ethnic lines and across racial lines at the individual level. But racism is something that is collective, is a collective construct. So I don't want to answer questions about Ms. Warren and Mr. Ali and so on. I am not in their heads. I don't know what their prejudices are. What I do know is that they are part of a government whose policies, when it comes to racial and ethnic equity, are serious questions, to the point of running the risk of being indicted, of being in favor of one race as against another race.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. I just want to understand the viewpoint, I appreciate it. Mr. Jonas, your final closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up the program.
Thank you, sir. There's a lot to take in and a lot to put back out. Okay, to start with Robbie. He mentioned my father, Black Guyanese, I think distantly related to David. And
yes.
He spoke about his difficulties in pre-independent Guyana. So I'm going to answer that because I don't agree with that. And I think that it left too much unsaid. At the time when Brown and Ministry of Education in the States was allowing segregation, blacks and whites in the schools in the States, my old man went to Queen's College in the 1940s. The school in Guyana, one of the best schools in the Commonwealth. In the 1940s, he encountered racism.
Mm-hmm.
He spoke of the headmaster at the time, Captain Nobbs, racist. I don't have a problem with that, but the system here had him in the best school. He taught Walter Rodney that you just mentioned in QC. Rodney was in Vickinson Ali's class. And one of the doctors said it was the brightest class he ever taught. The only class he knew bright was his own class, where Fred Wills was, another Black Guyanese, in Queen's College. The laws in Guyana are not inherently discriminatory or racist.
Right.
And our oppressors in Guyana, we got to deal with the current oppressors, because the legacy the British left us was, in the context of the 1960s, a good legacy. And it was for us to build on it and improve on it. And in response to my friend David, I gotta say, man up. Let us accept responsibility for our failures. Let us shoulder what we need to shoulder and do what we need to do and stop trying to blame someone else. And what David said is also absolutely true. Although there are no discriminatory laws in Guyana, the PPP friends still getting all the contracts. Absolutely true. Why is that? It is because the winner-take-all system, with their majority in Parliament, allows them to implement a Public Procurement Act that is toothless. So that over the past few weeks, we see the Public Procurement Commission coming up with all and sundry about why they can't do anything, about a big contract awarded in breach of all the tenets as to qualification, job experience, owning equipment, contract awarded. Nobody can do anything because they have used their majority in Parliament to impose their power to decide who's on the Public Procurement Commission and to take any penal clause out of the act, so that when there's a breach, if the breach is ever discovered by some accident, can't do anything about it. But don't let us blame the PPP for that alone, because there was an $18 million signing bonus that was hidden. And that same Public Procurement Commission, if you look at who it was manned by between 2015 and 2020, it didn't have PPP people in it. And if you look at how Burnham monopolized the economy in the 70s and 80s, it didn't have PPP people in it. So he's right. Right now, The government uses their majority to take it all. In the 70s and 80s, the government used their majority to take it all. It is pots and kettles. And the final point I want to make is you are all right. I agree with you entirely that we can't leave it up to those two parties to change it because they won't. As Ravi says, PPP knows the Indo-centric nature of what it is preaching, but couldn't care less and wouldn't recognize the principles involved. And although the PNC doesn't publicly speak Black rhetoric, they rely on it heavily to keep their faithful faithful. But the only people that they are concerned about on both sides is themselves, and the only pockets they want to fill and the only power they want to keep is for themselves. They couldn't care less. So you're right. There are good, honest people who sincerely want to do good, but they are outnumbered by the rotten, corrupt people who feel some sense of self-aggrandizement and are willing to do anything. And the only hope, given that neither of those two parties will change the rules, is to use the good fortune that has been given to us by the fact that we party so well together and have therefore eroded the majority of one by increasing the mixed population, so that hopefully for the first time in our history, the small, self-important, and Ravi, again, you're right, because it's some people who are going into these third parties that really think they're grand, and really we're not, we're insignificant. But hopefully for the first time, the balanced PNC PPP is so close that a third party can have that balance and give the opposition control of parliament. And then we can do a lot, because the two parties will not be changing the rules. And when my friend Ram talks about putting good people in to do things, well, man, let's buy castles for everybody. If we don't have a solid plan, we're wasting time. And those nice, highfalutin, high-fangled ideas about having good people to do good jobs, and nah, that's a little too vague. Let us be specific. Let us identify the changes that can be made with a majority opposition in parliament and accept that if government controls parliament, whether it's the pot or the kettle, we continue to be in trouble.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Mr. Jonas. Thank you to all our viewers for tuning in this evening. Thank you to our panelists for participating in this discussion. I thank first and foremost Mr. Noher Singh GlobeSpan for promoting these open discussions and dialogues on issues like this. And I also want to thank Devin. Without him, this program couldn't go on. So once again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to our audience. Take care.